Our Parshat Beshalach, serves as a bridge between the two most momentous events, not only in Sefer Shmot, but perhaps human history. And those are the story and the Exodus from Egypt, and Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah at Sinai. And the events that transpire over the course of this Parsha, they apparently serve to prepare the newly emancipated slaves for their new mission, the responsibilities which will be outlined in the Torah that the Jewish people would receive at Sinai. And as we study the transition Bnei Israel undergo in Parshat Beshalach, we cannot ignore a remarkable contrast in their attitude between the beginning and the end of the Parsha. You see, our Parsha begins with the pasuk Vayhi Beshalach Paro et ha'am v'lo nacham Elokim derech eretz plishtim ki karov hu, that when Pharaoh sent out the nation, God did not lead them by way of the land of Plishtim. Ki amar Elokim pen yinachem ha'am birotam milchama v'shavu mitzrayma, because Hashem said the people might have some change of heart when they see war and want to return to Egypt. And not surprisingly, the Jewish people, a former slave nation, left their Egyptian captors. They felt nervous and they felt uneasy on this new journey. And God knew that at the dawn of their freedom, Bnei Israel still lacked the confidence. They still lacked the emotional stamina necessary to confront war. And so God, therefore, takes them on this roundabout route that would avoid any chance of hostilities. And by the time we reach the Parsha's final psukim, all of this has changed. At the very end of our Parsha, we learn about how Amalek comes and fights Bnei Israel and refute him, and without hesitation in that moment, Yehoshua mobilizes a capable army, and Bnei Israel, with God's overt assistance, they respond valiantly to this surprise attack. The people are no longer afraid of war. They have reached the point where they can react to adversity with a sense of mission and responsibility. And appropriately then, the Parsha of preparation concludes on this note as Bnei Israel march forward from here to Parshat Yitro, where they'll finally receive the Torah. And so I think we have to ask ourselves, what aided and guided this enormous transition for the Jewish people? How did they change the entire way in which they looked at their lives and all the challenges that they faced? And so allow me to direct your attention for just a moment to a surprising and difficult story that takes place between these two bookends of our Parsha. You see, right after Kriyat Yamsuf, right after the splitting of the sea, after traveling 3 days without finding a water source, the Jewish people finally discover water in Marah, which, as the Torah tells us, they could not drink because it was too bitter. And in response to the people's complaints, Hashem instructs Moshe to cast a certain tree into the water, in which it would then miraculously would sweeten that water for the people. And the Torah describes this episode as Sham Samlo Chok Umishpat V'Sham Nisau, that the Jewish people were put to the test there in Marah. And the commentaries, they ask, why is it that Hashem chooses to decide to test the people at this point? Why not just show them that the water was sweetened by a miracle of Hashem without making them have to suffer through any of the bitterness at all? And so the Akedat Yitzchak, Rav Yitzchak Arama, he suggests that Hashem needed to test the Jewish people in this way specifically because they were now transitioning from a life in Egypt where everything was based on the laws of nature. But now as they moved towards Har Sinai, the Jewish people would experience an existence in which they were now totally dependent on God's miracles. If the Jewish people didn't experience some difficulties in living in the desert, then how would they ever appreciate the miracles that God did? And what's interesting is that the Kli Yakar has a different and in many ways opposite approach to this question. He writes that this episode in Marah was a preparation for Matan Torah, for the receiving of the Torah. Acceptance of the Torah and its totality can understandably feel bitter at the beginning. And yet, like the water in Marah, it becomes sweet as a person becomes more familiar with its teachings and practices. And so Hashem wanted to prepare Bnei Israel for all of that. And so he showed them that Hashem has the ability to sweeten anything that is bitter, including water. And perhaps we can suggest that these two approaches help us better understand how the Jewish people transitioned from the beginning to the end of our Parsha to be ready to receive the Torah. When starting a new chapter in life, or when you face crossroads, we are bound to face challenges, both major and minor. We know that's the case. And sometimes we can get chizuk. Sometimes we can find strength from a message that is in line with this opinion of the Akedas Yitzchak, Rav Yitzchak Arama's approach, that we are not in control, but rather it is Hashem who alone decides all of our outcomes and fates. And sometimes, on the other hand, it is the message along the lines of the Kli Yakar, that the beginning might be bitter, but over time, things will sweeten up and we just need to be patient. And these strategies of patience and understanding and having faith that God has a plan for us gives all of us the strength to overcome all of life's obstacles. And so as we continue to live in a challenging environment, let us use these tools so that we can eventually reach our own destinations and all of our experiences, so we can feel the joy and the glory of life, just as the Jewish people did when they arrived at Sinai. Shabbat Shalom.